Welcome back to Arise Prime Time, where we offer perspectives on the news and talking points of the day. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, Nigeria has often moved forward not by planning, but by shock. From civil war to military rule, from debt crisis to democratic transition, history suggests that the real change here has rarely come through calm consensus, but through deep national crisis that forced the country to confront itself. Today, Nigeria is not in a single defining emergency, but in a slow, grinding accumulation of failures, economic strain without collapse, insecurity without resolution, reforms without trust, elections without confidence. Enough pain to frustrate millions, perhaps not enough to compel collective action. So here's the uncomfortable question. Does Nigeria need a big crisis to finally get its act together, a sort of Trump intervention moment, a moment so disruptive it breaks old habits and resets the system? Or is that a dangerous myth that excuses leadership failure and gambles with people's lives? Well, to help us interrogate whether this country can truly reform only when pushed to the brink, I'm joined now in the studio by one of the best analytical minds in Nigeria today. Professor Ibrahim is a professor of political science, senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development, and chair of the editorial board at Premium Times newspaper. Prof, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
Let's try and pin this discussion down early. Does Nigeria historically reform only when it is cornered? And are we in a dangerous, slow decline precisely because there hasn't been one defining shock big enough to reset the system?
I think the reading you are proposing is a correct one. That significant reform have occurred in Nigeria only at moments of major shock to the system, where the entire political class feels and believes that it cannot continue as it had been doing, and that the survival of the system will require a dramatic reform. So that was clearly the case in the 1960s when the coup occurred. And the coup occurred because the key reforms that Nigerians were demanding, reform of the electoral system, reform of the regional system, reform of the census modalities, were all dismissed by the governing class. And therefore, it created a blockade that led to what Nzegu called the revolution of January 1966. And it's important for people to read his speech, because that was the message of his speech, that Nigeria was not amenable to reform, that a revolution was necessary to induce profound change, and that was why they were engaged, as he put it, in a revolution, and their method, as he put it, was going to be a revolutionary method. Of course, the rest is history. Things got out of hand. Iransi emerged, the civil war came, etc. And it was really after that that the question of regionalism was addressed with the creation of states in 1967. If you jump to the major change that led to the Fourth Republic, just as the change that led to the Second Republic, it was also the impossibility of reform under civilian administration, where the democracy was not working. In 1979, there were free and fair elections. 1983, heavily and clearly rigged election that created a shock that brought in military rule. Exactly the same thing under the Babangida administration. An election that was moving very smoothly got caught up in a rejection of the outcome by the Babangida administration. And that precipitated a series of crises that eventually led to the Fourth Republic. So the Nigerian governing classes successively have completely rejected the line of reform, even when it was clear to everybody that that was the only way to save the country. And it's only under force that they had been ready to accept reform.
And sort of jumping to today, if you believe that crisis drives reform, what kind of crisis are we really talking about in today's context? Economic collapse, electoral breakdown, state failure, and who bears the cost? I mean, if crisis is the trigger for reform, how do you ensure it breaks only resistance from those in power and not society itself?
The problem with society, and this is a general point, is that society is capable of taking a lot of punishment. At certain times, this series of punishments lead to expression of anger. When there's anger that's expressed openly, but then that anger rarely transforms into substantive change because the political class has now the capacity to move in swiftly. Palliatives is the key word, to dull the anger, to reduce it, to divert it, or to more commonly introduce divisions between those who are expressing anger so that the strength of the movement becomes weakened. We saw that with the youth revolt of a few years ago,
The
the
NSAS
NSAS,
protest,
where
right.
the major strategy of the state was to bring divisiveness into the movement to break its strength. So that has been the problem. People are really ready every now and then to express their anger and to show they've had enough. But to go back to the question, there's a sense in which the crisis we're in today is one of the most serious we've ever had in the history of this country. First of all, we have the crisis of livelihoods. Over 65% of Nigerians are living in poverty. This is higher than it was in 1960, higher than in 1990, higher than in 1980. We have more poor people in the country today than we've ever had in our history. And that should be really a cause for general concern.
And yet, that persistent hardship fails to produce reform.
Absolutely.
What is missing? Is it leadership? Is it the institutions? Is it public pressure? Or have Nigerians been conditioned, and I think you touched on this earlier, have they been conditioned to endure just enough pain to survive, but never enough to rebel?
Well, mounting poverty has rarely led to reform around the world because people are in such a struggle for survival that this struggle is translated in their individual daily lives. They must get enough to eat today. They never think of tomorrow. And that consumes all their energy for that day. And the next day they begin again. So it doesn't really lead to reform. But I think the most substantive crisis we are in now is the security crisis. This country has never been as insecure and as unsafe as it is today. And this is something that directly brings state responsibility into the question. Because the state, our constitution says, has a responsibility to provide for the welfare and for the security of Nigerians. With massive poverty, our welfare is not catered for. With massive insecurity, Nobody is protecting Nigerians from armed banditry, insurrection, and what have you. So the crisis today is a very serious one. Then you add the political crisis, where democracy is disappearing before our very eyes, where the fundamental principles are being dulled, where the National Assembly and the presidency is showing a clear commitment to disrupting multi-party democracy in the country, imposing a one-party regime, shutting up the opposition, shutting up criticisms, and finally, using money to bribe all voices that try to speak. If they can't bribe them, they put them in jail. They find excuses to do that. So the crisis we are facing today is almost total crisis. But because it's so generalized and because it affects so many people, it's not having the type of dramatic impact much lesser levels of crisis had produced in the past. But I think there's an issue that people don't know, especially Nigeria's governing class, that this belief of this government, and this is what I pick up in beer parlor talk, that every Nigerian has a price. If you cannot be bribed, more money can bribe you. So that's the attitude, that they can take care of everybody who tries to. But that is often the case until the time when there is an explosion. Unfortunately, in social science, we never can tell when that explosion will be. We still don't have the tools to understand what the signals are and how that signals will translate into timing in terms of the explosion.
Indeed, but looking at it from a theoretical point of view, that disruptive turning point, some have suggested that the logic of that sort of suggestion that there is a reset after some kind of national trauma, that the logic is in itself reckless when it comes to a country like Nigeria or other countries, because in a fragile state, and they suggest that Nigeria is fragile, a big crisis could tip into state failure rather than reform.
Absolutely, and that's really the fear. And, we already have a lot of signs of state failure. The first definition of a state is that they have the monopoly of the use of arms. There are 6 million guns in the hands of civilians in this country. And that's more than the guns in the hands of the agents of the Nigerian state. So already the state is really, really extremely fragile. And that's a clear sign of the beginning of state failure, when the state no longer has the monopoly of the means of violence, legitimate use of violence in society.
Yeah, but you could make the same argument about the United States of America, where people legitimately carry a lot of arms. I mean, virtually everybody in America, some of them have several guns and all that equipment, and yet
no,
you don't
not
describe
the arms.
that as a sort of failed state.
It's not the arms. Take the case of Switzerland. Every male adult in Switzerland has a machine gun supplied to him by the state. But in the history of Switzerland in the last 300 years, there's only been 2 or 3 cases where somebody has taken that arm and used it for something illegal. So it's not the possession of the arms, it's the way in which the arms are used against the law, against constituted authority. And the problem in Nigeria is that these young people with arms are using it for insurrection, are using it for kidnapping, are using it for banditry, are using it to attack people on the basis of their religious faith. They are using it in series of illegal and unconstitutional means, and that's why it becomes a very serious crisis.
Right. We're almost out of time. Fascinating discussion, as always, with you. If you had to choose steady decline with modest reforms or disruptive shock with uncertain outcome, which would you say is more dangerous for Nigeria?
I think what is more dangerous is the refusal for gradual reform. We are not reforming this country. The past week, for example, is a key issue when Nigerians have realized that the National Assembly, or the Senate in particular, is trying to compromise the electoral process to make it easier to rig elections. That's the objective of their proposed reform. And that's something that hurts Nigerians, that frightens Nigerians, and makes them realize they're going to lose even the little democracy that we have because of the recklessness of a political class that wants to stay in power irrespective of the wishes of the Nigerian citizen. By taking this attitude, they really pose the risk of precipitating the country into a major national crisis.
Prof, thank you very much indeed. It's brilliant to get your assessment. Professor Ibrahim is a professor of political science, senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development, and chair of the editorial board at Premium Times newspaper. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.